Hello everyone, welcome to our first YouTube presentation on your English. Right, let's try this again. So today we're going to be taking a look at your Eduqas English literature papers and the text that go with them. So you will have to sit 4 different exam papers. You will have to sit literature paper 1, which is 40% of your total grade and 2 hours in length. You will have to sit your literature paper 2, which is 60% of your English literature grade, is 2 hours and 30 minutes in length. Your English language paper 1, which is 40% of your language grade and 1 hour 45 minutes long, and your English language paper 2, which is 60% and 2 hours long. So we're going to start off with literature first. So if we just go into your literature. Now, your literature paper 1, this is the shorter of your 2 literature exams at 2 hours long and looks at your Shakespeare and your anthology poetry. Okay, both parts of these are equally weighted, so your Shakespeare is just as important as your anthology poetry. Those of you that are good at maths will have noticed that as it is 2 hours long and you've only got 2 sections, you are going to need to use 1 hour for your Shakespeare and 1 hour for your poetry. Now, the way that this works is your Shakespeare, you will answer 1 text's worth of questions. Okay, so you will have the choice of either Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth or Merchant of Venice or Much Ado About Nothing or Henry V. You need to select the questions on the play that you have studied. There's no point in trying to answer a question on Much Ado when you have only studied Romeo and Juliet, okay, or trying to answer a question on all of the plays, as it won't work. Now, once you've found your text that you've studied, you need to select the right questions. You'll have 2 questions, a question A and a question B. Okay, question A will be an extract that they will give you with a question based on that extract and the wider text, and question B will be an essay style question on the entire play. So it will ask you, say, how a character is presented throughout the entire play, or how a key theme or idea is presented throughout the entire play. Okay, one of these questions is worth 15 marks, which is your question A, as it is the shorter extract question, and your question B is worth 25 marks, adding up to a total of 40 marks. Okay, now the second half of this is your poetry anthology. Now this you should have annotated. If you don't have every single poem annotated and have started to create flashcards and things to help you remember quotes from it, you really need to get on and do that. You'll be asked 2 questions based on this anthology. Now, any poem that they give you in this section is one that you would have had a chance at seeing before, okay, and they will give you 1 poem. So for instance, if they want you to compare something like love, they might look at you they might look at Sonnet 43, for instance, and then ask you to analyse a key theme, and then the second question ask you to talk about a key theme in Sonnet 43 and one of the other poems, and that is when your ability to link the poems together and know the quotes comes from. Once again, the marks on this one are split 15 and 25 for a grand total of 40 marks overall. Okay. Prezi's just been a bit weird. So that is your literature paper 1. Okay, fairly self-explanatory. Now, moving into literature paper 2. Now, this one is obviously worth far more of your grade. It's worth 60% of your grade and is also the longest English paper that you will sit at 2 hours and 30 minutes long. This one, knowing what you are doing in what order and the timings for it is key. So you will have to do a question on your post-1914 drama or prose, so your modern day text, or play. You will need to do a question on your 19th century prose, so your Victorian era story, and you will need to answer some questions on your unseen poetry. Each one of these sections is equally weighted at 20% of the final grade, so you will need to work out your timings for that. Now it's 2.5 hours long for a reason. Yes, that's an exceptionally long time, but the reason that you have 2.5 hours for it is so that you can be writing for that amount of time, and it gives you the time to answer each question thoroughly. If you're sitting there after an hour and a half going, well, I've answered all of them, you're going to be hemorrhaging marks. and no one needs that. So if we just take a quick look at the first section that you will come across, which will be your post 1914 drama or prose. Now this, you will have one source based question from one of your pre-studied texts. Now this is a text that you will have looked at, you would have studied in class, but just for your reference, the list of them that you can look is just there in the right hand corner. So make sure that you're looking at that list and you are understanding which text you have done on this. Now for most people would have studied a piece of drama, so your two you got sort of Blood Brothers and Spectacles or History Boys are the three most common. However, you might have your school might have made the decision for you to do two pieces of prose, in which case you might have done something like Lord of the Flies or Woman in Black would be the two most common there. You only at this point select one text for this. Okay, and you'll be asked one source-based question from one of these texts. So for instance, if you have studied an Inspector Calls, you might be asked a question on how Mr. Burling is presented throughout the play. Okay, and it will give you a section of the play for you to be able to base your answer on, but you need to have knowledge of the whole story of whatever that might be. Okay. Now, as well as that, once you've finished your post-1914 drama or prose, it will then move on to your 19th century prose. Once again, this is equally weighted, so you spend as much time on this as you would anything else, and it is also one source-based question from a pre-studied text. So again, you need to make sure that you are answering a question on the right text. There is no point, if you have studied Silas Marner, to answer a question on Pride and Prejudice, and vice versa. So you will have one question. So say you were doing A Christmas Carol, your question will likely be something surrounding one of the key themes or key characters in that. That will be your source, that will be your question. You answer that one. You only answer one question on this. Now there will only be one question of text anyway in the paper, but make sure that the question you are answering is to do with your text. I know that sounds self-explanatory, but we need to make sure that we're getting these basics right. Now, lastly, the unseen poetry. Now students typically find this the most daunting aspect. Now your unseen poetry is equally weighted, okay? However, this is the only section in this paper that will ask you about two questions. Now, the reason I ask you two questions is it will ask you one question on a poem. Now, last year's GCSE had something along the lines of winter. Okay, so it asked you about a poem. It gave you a poem called Winter, which is obviously about winter. Okay, got you to analyse that and the key themes within that in one question. Then the second question, it introduced another poem, for instance, Summer. Okay, and then asked you to compare it, and then obviously you would compare the two, looking at the key themes and key ideas. Now, they're not expecting you to know these poems in as much detail as your anthology poetry, but they are looking for you to be able to pick out key ideas and be able to structure a comparison effectively, okay, between the two. And they will give you poems that you are able to spot similarities between, okay, but we will go into how to tackle unseen poetry in another video. So that is your two literature papers. Now, the important thing to remember is that English is now double weighted, which means that you get a separate grade for your English literature and your English language. So in theory, you pass one of them and you've passed English. Now, you might be sitting there going, do you know what, I'm really, really strong in English literature, but I don't have a clue about language, and vice versa. So my advice would be for you to work on whichever one you feel weaker on. So for instance, if you're sitting there going, I don't know how to answer the English language style questions, use your English literature text to write out yourself English language style questions. And equally, if you're sat there going, well, I'm okay with the language, but I don't know the literature, use the language style questions to look at your literature texts. Okay. Now, your first English language paper is 40% of your marks. It's an hour and 45 minutes long. Now, both of your English language papers are split into two sections, section A and section B. Okay, both are equally weighted with 40 marks apiece. However, what each one asks you to do is very, very different. So, for instance, section A is 40 marks, and you are going to be looking at one piece of prose, so one piece of fiction writing of roughly 600 to 1,000 words. Okay, so it's not a long piece. All right, but then you're going to be asked 5 questions that will go in a specific order. Now, there'll be more information on these questions in a different video, okay, but it will ask you to answer a very set amount of videos. set amount of questions, not set amount of videos. Okay, and these questions will go from 5 marks to 10 marks. Okay, and you need to make sure that you're really strict on your timings to get through that. Obviously, you've got an hour and 45 minutes, so you're going to need to just split this down the middle. The important thing with this one is to get a really rough idea of what the whole text is about. Okay, and then work methodically through the questions, as the questions will go, look at lines 1 to 7, answer these questions, then it'll be look at lines 8 to etc. So if you've read the whole article, the whole piece, and have an idea of what it's on about across the board, then you'll be in a really good position to be able to tackle every single one of those questions. Section B, however, is your creative writing. Now, you will be given 4 different titles, okay, and they're usually things like write a story that began with whatever, okay, but you need to select one of these titles, not 2, not 3, 1, okay, because this piece of writing is for you to create one piece of creative writing. You will be given marks, 24 of which based on your content and organisation, so what you're writing about, okay, and 16 marks of that will be based on your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So as you can see, how you write it plays a massive part of this. So it is worth always going through and making sure, am I writing in paragraphs? Have I used a full stop capital letter? Could I use some more imaginative punctuation here? Can I use my short sentences for to increase pace, etc, etc? These things are really useful to have in the back of your mind. Also, one of the things the examiners mentioned last time round was how there was a lack of creativity from some students, and they awarded with that in regard. So taking time in lessons and taking time in your revision sessions to kind of feed your creative juices and practice creative writing, I would say take the time to do that, because if you go in and rewrite the story of Titanic, they're going to give you less marks than if you came up with a completely new idea off the cuff. This should be a good opportunity for you to show your mastery of the English language. Okay, and it is, as I say, important to remember that you are to do one of the potential titles, not any more than that. Okay, now English language paper 2 is slightly different. Now, as with English literature, English language, the second paper, is slightly longer and is worth 60% of your marks. Okay. Now, this one once again is split into 2 sections. We'll get onto the third little planet in a moment. Okay, but section A is slightly different. So, whereas in section A in paper 1, you were looking at 1 piece, in this one you're looking at 2 pieces of non-fiction. So it might be newspaper articles, it might be diary entries, okay, something of that sort. One of these pieces will be from the 19th century, so looking at your Victorian era style pieces, and one will be from the modern day, from the 21st century. You'll be expected to answer 6 structured questions. These follow the same basic structure as language paper 1, although there are some variations. As you're looking at 2 texts, one of the questions will ask you to compare and another one will ask you to evaluate, but there'll be more of that in another video. But the important thing to remember is these texts are going to be having very different viewpoints because of the context in which they are written. An author that is writing in the 19th century is going to have a very different outlook to one writing in the 21st century, and equally the language that they are using is going to be very different. So when you are revising for your section A of language paper 2, you need to be remembering that these texts are coming from very different places in our history, so you need to bear that in mind when you are tackling those questions. Now, the section B, okay, again is creative style writing. However, it is your transactional writing. Now, the difference is you're going to have to do 2 shorter pieces, okay, and this is where that extra time comes in. You will have to do 2 compulsory pieces of transactional writing. So this means you don't get a choice, and they will say to you, this is what you were doing, and you need to just do it. Obviously, these 2 pieces are going to be shorter than the 1 piece you put together for language paper 1. However, they will ask you to either inform, persuade, or argue. Okay, so a classic one would be to persuade the head teacher of a school to spend their budget on what you want them to spend it on, or argue against something about an issue. So argue about going to war, for instance, and giving your point of view. Informing is slightly more tricky, but there will be another video on this. But informing could be telling people about why they should visit the zoo without persuading them. So it is a bit of a tricky one, and the examiners will tend to stick to persuade and argue. But please bear in mind that with this you will need to do 2 of those tasks. So they are split into 2 20-mark questions. Okay, so please bear that in mind. Now, I've put speaking and listening here because speaking and listening has changed from being a weighted part of your exam to non-weighted. So your speaking and listening now is a non-weighted compulsory presentation. Now, most of you will have done this before you even go into an exam hall for the first time. But just in case you haven't, your speaking and listening now doesn't actually count towards your GCSE, although in order to be awarded with a GCSE, you've got to attempt it. So what that means is if you just sit there and go, I am absolutely not going to do this, regardless of what you tell me, then you will not be able to get either of the other 2 GCSEs you sat exams for. So what you will need to do is you will need to give a presentation. Your presentation can be on anything, so I would advise you choose something that you feel really passionate about, as the presentation needs to be between ideally 7 and 10 minutes long. That includes time responding to questions. Now, this presentation could be anything. You're being assessed on your ability to put your points of view across and have a discussion, and also respond to questions. Now, the bad news for some of you is that this needs to be done in front of an audience. However, the good news of that is the definition of what an audience is can be adapted. So, for instance, if you only want to present to 2 of your best friends and the teacher, then that's absolutely fine. This will be graded then and there. And then that will be sent off to the exam boards for you. But as it's not weighted, it doesn't actually form part of your final grade and will appear on your exam certificate as a separate pass, merit, distinction, fail grade underneath your English literature and English language grades. Okay, so I hope that has added some clarity to the situation. The English language exams are difficult to get your head around, but once you've got your head around them, it becomes much easier to gather what you need to do at each individual section. So please do take the time to sit down and look at these. The other thing I would recommend doing is, if you have access to the internet, which you obviously do if you're watching this video, is on the Eduqas website. If you just type into Google Eduqas English Literature or Eduqas English Language, then you're able to get the what are called the specifications, which give you a layout of how each exam is laid out, so you can have a look at the format for yourselves. But as I say, there will be other videos on that coming online soon. So thank you for watching, thank you for sticking with it. Hopefully that has made some sense, and please comment and subscribe. Many thanks.